If you don't want to appear, please send us an email. And the email that I'm going to put in the chat now, so that we can either remove the image or send you the recording. So let me introduce myself. I'm Livinia Pinheiro. I'm one of the members of the coordination department of PACOVA. PACOVA is a civil society organization created at the end of 2023, which aims to strengthen grassroots organizations that are on the front line of fighting for rights. And so in terms of grassroots organizations, we're talking about social movements, community movements, grassroots organizations. All of these come into our scope. And those who fight to strengthen rights. As a strategy to fulfill our mission, we work with 3 principal programs: PIOPI, which supports grassroots organizations, where we supply technical support and information support for legal issues, communications, and fundraising for financial organization. We also have another program, which is FIOPI, which is a fund to support grassroots organizations that organizations can apply to. And we have our advocacy program, which is support advocacy within the philanthropic field. And within this field, within this program, our research emerged, which is the result of, which was run by PACOVA, supported by ACP, and which aims to nationally map the main barriers that grassroots organizations have with grassroots communication and community and territorial communication. And it's based on dialogue with our partners about the difficulties that they've had as organizations, grassroots organization, the barriers that they face in terms of fulfilling their aims. We looked at all the different areas that they need to maintain their activities. And so we looked at national level, and its aim is to help planning for funding streams and as a support for advocacy activities to strengthen social movements within their grassroots communications as a cause and as something that supports democracy. So we'd like to support this idea in order to guarantee funding. I'm going to now invite Alberti, who is our executive director, to share some of the quantitative data. He's going to talk for 15 minutes. Sorry. No, I'm going to first of all invite Sophia Gois, who from ICAP, which is our partner organization, sponsored the research. She's the coordinator of networks, partnerships, etc. for ICP. And she's been working for more than 10 years in the third sector and has worked for various other institutions. She's a master in sustainability from HVDS in Sao Paulo. Good afternoon. Albert asked me to send this biography so that I can talk about how my representation of the institution. But first of all, I'd like to really talk at a more personal level, to tell you a story. I worked for some time in the Fee Institute. What it did is, and still does, supports people, companies that want to donate to civil society organizations and that either don't know these organizations or don't trust in their work. And we know that this is unfortunately very frequent. People don't trust in these organizations, in our work, in our sector. And so the Fee Institute presented these organizations to these people and was like a curator and worked to guarantee that, firstly, that the organization was serious, the one that was going to receive funding. So we acted as a kind of bridge to ensure that accounting and reporting worked properly. So to bring these people into our field. And the story that I would like to tell you is that once I went to monitor an investor, accompany an investor on a visit to Campo Limpo in the outskirts of Sao Paulo, which is a new school. And I invited them today to participate today. And when we got there, I said, oh, we're nearly there. We're nearly there. And it's here. Are we already here in Campo Limpo? And he asked because in his imagination, Campo Limpo was the least beautiful, most dangerous place in his eyes, much more than what he was actually seeing. And this is because he only knew Campo Limpo from the newspaper, which doesn't reflect people really in Campo Limpo. He doesn't, so he didn't have an idea of their uniqueness. And so reading the research, which I have already had the privilege to read, I was thinking about this a lot, that the world story is about the exclusion of stories, the erasure, and the domination of narratives. The narratives is about power. And so we don't get to tell our own stories, to re-signify them, because we need to claim this space. And I would like to congratulate Alberti and Pakova and everybody who's here for the such important work that they're doing. Thank you, Sophia, for your considerations. And now, please feel free to ask questions. We will have time. Firstly, Albert will explain the research, and then some of the people we interviewed will talk. And then we're going to have a moment for people to talk and to generally contribute, to ask questions. Please put your questions in the chat, or you can say them if you would prefer. If you'd like to know more about Pacova, we're in Bahia, but we also work at national level, and our headquarters, our offices are in Uchinga. Now I'm going to pass over to Albert, our executive director, who will have 15 minutes. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Alberti, the executive director of Pacova, an activist for social movements for a long time. I would like to talk about some of the challenges and to speak a bit more slowly for our translator. I will thank him if he does. So let's see if we can meet this challenge. So I'm going to talk a bit to make and we will make available the material, but I'm going to just look. We will hear from the people within the territories in order to see the face of the organizations, because just numbers and data can, but it means that you still don't know who we're talking about. So we will have time to talk, to see the interviewees, but we're going to start now with Mateus, you can pass. Okay, here we are. So these are the this is to talk about the profile of the organizations that we are mapping. So we asked them, the first question was whether they had a CNPJ, which is a company registration number. And so some of them have this registration number, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their documentation is compliant, because the bureaucratic processes are very complicated. And many of them do not have them. And this can be a big barrier to lots of different things. So we have these two profiles. 50%, we have people who opt not to register because they don't want to register, or some of them had difficulties in formalizing their situation as an organization. And some of them are in the process of formalizing their documentation. So here we have 50% said yes and 44 no. And this is how long the organizations had been in existence. So we have time of existence on the left, 0 to 4 years, 5 to 9, 10 to 19, and at the end, more than 30%. So most of them were, as you can see, between 5 and 9 years of existence. And the more recent one, 23%, had only been in existence for 4 years. So this shows a kind of emergence within this field. And on the other hand, there are the fewer who've been going for longer. So 6% for 20 to 29 and 4% for more than 30 years. And some of them face barriers in continuing. And these are the types of organizations that we're looking at. Digital platforms, 26%, audio-visual production, periphery media, Black media, community radios, indigenous media, and print media. Then 26% digital platforms, and audiovisual production is 20%. So these are have different profiles: LGBTQ, quilombos, women's. Some of them cross various types of organization. So it depends according to their territory as well. What we can see is periphery media and Black media, 16 and 12%. This is with communication linked to their identities, community radios as well. And we have in print media at 5%, as you can see. And some of them work in a more hybrid way as well. There are some indigenous media as well. So it's interesting that there's a set of different types of experiences. But there are, and some of them have reach within different other types. So for example, the periphery media might work with the young Black media. So this shows that popular communication has various types of models that it's working in, and some of them based on identity. And here we're looking at the regions. As you can see, the North, Northeast, Central West, Southeast, and South. There's a very strong concentration in the Northeast, 54%, and 21% in the North, 10 in the Center West, 8 in the Southeast, and 7 in the South. And this shows the vigor of this field in the North and Northeast. And in terms of teams and payment, if we look just to finish looking at the profile, we have here whether they have the size of the team and what percentage of the team is paid. And so we're looking at the difference between voluntary, those who are working voluntary, and paid. So So they have small, on the whole, small teams. So if you look at 1 to 3 people and 4 to 6 people in the team, it's 27% and 38%. And 7 to 10 is 10%, and more than 10 is 25th. One of the things that we really noticed was the insecurity in terms of their working situations. So many of them working with 100% volunteers, 54%, 61, etc. So those between 4 and 6 people in the team, 61% had a 100% volunteer team. You can follow the rest of the table here. Even the larger organizations still had a significant number of people working as volunteers. In terms of, have you ever accessed funding, financial support? No, 46%, and yes, 54%. So at some point within their life of their organization, 54% had accessed some type of funding. And we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. So where did this funding come from? We were looking here at sources. What were the sources of funding? So of those who obviously have received funding, the large majority, it was for NGOs or foundations, national NGOs or foundations, and that is Brazilian foundations or NGOs. And it's more than half the funding comes from this source of domestic funding. And then 21% international. And when we look at public funding or paid announcements, so advertising by public funding, that's 19%. And then private companies are only 6%, unions 1%, and donations from readers or individual donations 1%. This last one, it's important for us to consider and to understand this data about individual donors. So we can see that it's very much an incipient field. And then the amount of funding received. So those who have received some funding at some point in time, 46 had never accessed any kind of funding. And then of those who had, up to 50,000 Brazilian reals is 35%, up to 100,000, 12%, and between 50 and 100,000 Brazilian reais, 7%. Mostly they're one-off funding, small amounts. And so what we're going to see later is the impact this has on infrastructure. And remembering that 46% had never seen any funding. And remembering that some of these organizations have been going for more than 20 years. So, which means that even if the organization has been going for a long time, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have solved your funding problem. So here we're going to look at obstacles. When we looked at the amount, whether they access funding frequently or regularly, and 79% said they had not accessed funding regularly. And we look, and here we reduced the funding bands to examine this a bit more carefully. 79% didn't access funding regularly. So 46% had never, and then of the others who had, most of them didn't regularly access funding. And so we're looking at one-off funding, and 12% up to 5,000 reals regularly, more than 20,000, 5%, and 4% between 5 and 20,000 Brazilian reals regularly. So we're looking at low amounts and low frequency in terms of the funding situation. And now you might ask, what are the barriers? What are the barriers that they're... First of all, we asked, had they faced barriers in accessing funding? And 88% said yes, they had. Only 12% said they had not. As you can see here in the table. It was a multiple choice question. We asked, what are the obstacles that you have faced in accessing funding? We left it open as well. And the reasons you can see here: lack of technical support for funding raising. We looked at a very wide range. We saw a very wide range of obstacles. 21% a lack of technical support. Since they don't have this technical support, they find that a barrier. And then we see the lack of having this CNPJ, which is the official registration number. Either they didn't have it or they had difficulty keeping up to date with their compliance. So we understand that this shows that the demand to have a company registration can be an exclusionary barrier to accessing funding. And other related to bureaucracy, 13% said they had problems with understanding technical language. 13% said they found funding streams very rigid, that ignore their contexts. Also the demand to have digital infrastructure, for example, computers, that was also a barrier. And also that information is not very accessible. If you see, that's also related to the difficulty of language. Also the requirement for the organization to have a longer life, to have been going for long, because often there is a minimum time of existence that is a requirement for funding. There's 6% mentioned this as a barrier. And difficulty, the last one, is difficulty in competing with larger institutions. And then there are also those that didn't reach the 1% level, but which were mentioned in the more open question. Problems to do with statutes, statutory issues, and difficulty with specific support, technical support, and the need to constantly fit into the demands of funding. In other words, they're having to change their work to fit the funding rather than the other way around. So this is an issue. So they need to adapt their work. And now we're going to just look very quickly at the regions. In the north, you can see in the material, but we're just here trying to look at some of the main points. Small organizations, but great efforts being made. That was part of the profile for the north. Small teams, mostly supported by volunteers. This was very common. In the northeast, we saw one-off support. Very rare to see continued support. national philanthropy, Brazilian philanthropy was the main funder, large teams, but empty pockets. Again, working with volunteers. In the Southeast, the profile. Okay, large teams, but again, working often without payment. Lots of funds, but concentrated in small groups. So the Southeast was a territory with a lot of contrasts in accessing funding. I was talking to people that we have in the Southeast, we have a big contrast, but because it's many of the organizations don't reflect what's going on in the territories. So there are many organizations in the Southeast that don't have access to funding. In the South, they'd all accessed funding of some sort at some point, but most of them without regular funding. The same idea with large teams, but still mostly volunteers. And although all the organizations in the Southeast were formalized, this doesn't necessarily resolve all the issues. And in the Central West, because I'm coming to the end of my 15 minutes, I need to do quickly. Small teams, mostly run by volunteers. Their funding is mostly national and some public funding. And one of the big issues here is the issue of a lack of formalization, because it's very present there, this exclusionary issue of not having themselves registered formally and not being complied. So this is the general overview. And we have also recommendations, which we're going to make available for 3 issues: for the philanthropic ecosystem, for public policies, and for the organizations themselves. So we have 3 streams of recommendations, which are available within the document. So this is what I would like to, wanted to share with you. And now we're going to hand over to the territories themselves. Thank you very much. Thank you, Albertje. Just saying again that the presentation is being recorded. Please let us know if you have a problem with that. If you don't want to appear, please let us know. Please send an email to Mateus Pacova and we will remove your image. And please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the chat. At the moment, we're going through a period of listening, but later we'll have a chance to talk. So now I'm going to talk to Jonathan Piero, who's a journalist. He's the editorial coordinator of the Afirmativa journal. He's a master in communications from the Federal University of Recôncavo, and he's now studying his doctorate in contemporary culture at the Federal University of Bahia. So I'm handing over to you, Jonathan. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon to everybody. I'd like to thank you for the invitation. Seeing Paco, I saw Paco when it was being born. We have various people here that I know, that we've done activities together. I'm just going to present quickly a little bit about our trajectory and Congelo. Here we go. And sorry, I think I might have stopped. So Jonas is talking about his organization and the black media and doing work against the hegemonic narrative. The initial idea was for the journal to be printed, but we are more focusing on digital platform. After this, we left the university and we began to look for ways to maintain ourselves as an organization. In 2014, 15, 16, we started to look for ways to maintain the journal. And we got some support from the university. Once we left the university, we didn't have access anymore to those funds. And we looked at ways to get paid and to continue running the journal. We had a lot of struggles. In 2016, we managed our first funding. We were able to achieve our first funding, which was an award from the Public Prosecutor's Office. And then there was the coup when Dilma was taken out of office and Temer came in, and then there was Temer, and we never received the funding for this award. And so it was award, so we wouldn't have had to do all the reporting that you have to for other funding, but we never received the money. It was 50,000 reals, which at the time would have made a big difference, but it was one of the many difficulties that we've faced over this time. In order to, from 2016 to 2020, we managed to achieve some one-off funding, and it's of the little funding that there is for grassroots communication, it's mostly national philanthropy. We managed to get a little bit here, a little bit there, some from CESI. And then we managed to launch our third press edition with a bit bigger, and we got some money from the Brazilian Funding of Human Rights, but it was always one-off. This was the problem. And a lot of our work is voluntary. So I did some paid work as an administrator. Somebody else worked for a different broadcaster, and then we maintained the journal as volunteers. And it's our dream for 15 years we've been working in this dream, but from 2020 we began to have access to a bit more funds. This is when we had the extreme right government here, and so we were able to get a bit more funding for human rights. And at this time, we managed to go through some institutional strengthening. And when we began to pay ourselves and to have a team a bit more robust, and then began to think about other ways of operating. So now we provide services for civil society organizations, various platforms. So providing services is a way of, seems to be the only way to get some funding, because with one-off funding, we can't manage to keep maintaining the organization. And I think this is we have to start thinking about what we think about philanthropy. And I did some research, and in the Black press, I see that many newspapers, most of them, only survived for 1 or 2 years. And this is because of a lack of funding. If you go back to the 80s, when during the dictatorship, you could make a newspaper that was completely against the stream, and it was very difficult to run these newspapers. And we learn about all the difficulties in maintaining newspapers from that time, selling them and requesting support. So what I want to say is that historically, Black media, the community media, grassroots media, all these historically, they are not funded. There is a difficulty of these communications means, these media, to maintain themselves because of funding. And doing for communication in Brazil isn't cheap or easy, it's expensive. And then you have I have a criticism about philanthropy, because these Brazilian philanthropists don't have good communication means. They don't reflect a more complex situation like the one that we're going through at the moment. There's a criticism of the progressive movement, so they don't know how to communicate. And we know that the extreme right does know how to communicate. Since the coup, or when you're going to criticize the corporate media, all of this. On the other hand, philanthropy has never really understood communications as something to be invested in part of social justice. They don't really understand how the communications is really a human right. Even within this context, we have the funds, we have investing, the philanthropic sector in Brazil, most of them do not have funding streams or lines of funding communications. This means that even if we through digital platforms, we can have some survival, they will never be, it will be very difficult to have specific funding for these organizations, communications organizations, to maintain themselves. And I think it's something connected to global politics as well, and regional. What happens? Most of these funds that invest in communications, most of these funds are concentrated in the Southeast. There's a recent research that shows this. And it's crazy, isn't it? That Albert's research shows that many of these ones researched in this research were in the Northeast. I was really impressed by this. So there's a great concentration of philanthropy funds in the Southeast, and they are accessing an economic ecosystem which is different from the other regions. So the North and the Northeast particularly always have this image of, in terms of international funders, there is a very little international funding, but what there is still concentrated in the Southeast. And so I think one of the big dilemmas for philanthropy, for these organizations, is firstly that philanthropy needs to understand communications as a human right, and a line of funding that requires investment, deserves investments. And the second is the decentralization of funds into regions which require more funding. So this is a big dilemma, which in fact, social organizations working in communications and all in Black media, etc., need to work. Otherwise, we're going to just carry on with this issue with special funding streams for specific organizations, which is It means that we always have to link our work to some external issue which is external to communications, because most of this funding is one-off. And direct funding, there is no continued direct funding. And when you have funding for specific issue, your organization can't necessarily decide what to do with this money. This happens a lot with grant making and other practices. There should be more autonomy for the organizations, because they're the ones in the territories and they're the ones that understand better what's going on. And Brazilian philanthropy needs to come to this perspective, to give more autonomy to the organizations and to fund and to not to give one-off funding, but more ongoing funding, especially for grassroots communications, so that we can continue to exist. That's my main point, that so that we can carry on existing and doing our work. When Afirmativa has been going for 11 years, there are other types of Black media as well that exist, but they end up closing because of lack of funding. And I think that this research is going to help and give support, but beyond the diagnosis, which is essential. Pakova did this very well, but I haven't read all of it, but in parts, I think this change of attitude is to think about and understand that communications is the motor of civil society organizations, and that when there are moments of threats to democracy, for example, we need to say, oh my God, but this newspaper is always in favor of those who are more powerful. And this comes from the mentality that communications is an image and not a driver. I need to finish now because I think I've gone over my time. I think that we need to change the mentality and look at other sectors, communications, particularly within this context of big tech, etc., which are affecting democracy. We need to understand communications as a transformative tool for society. I think that's it. Sorry if I've gone on a bit. Thank you very much, Jonas. You summarized it very well, what we need. That's what we need to say about this research, what we need to reassert, how communications, and affirmative is one of them, how much they need to be central protagonists of their funding. Now I'm going to invite Coletivo Jianguachá, who's from the Kayagangi people. She's 27 years old. She lives in Tequararim, in Paraná. She's a mother, a communicator, and one of the founders of the Jianguachá Collective, Communications Collective. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank Pakova for their research. As I said, I was so surprised to have this feedback, because so often we participate in research and no one comes back to tell us anything. So we were really surprised and very happy to have this opportunity to be heard. And as I'm Mariani, I'm one of the communicators of the collective, one of the founders. The collective started as a dream as an indigenous people, and me as a Kaigani, and also Guaranis and different peoples working together. We saw that we were very invisible. and we can't show our bases. We wanted to be able to record and take photos out to show the importance within our territories and outside. And it's not just a struggle. There are also nice things that we'd like to show. And the collective started with this idea. And obviously, we came across large obstacles. Of course, one of these, you need to have this CNPJ registration in order to access funding. And then you have to have been going for 5 years before you can formalize. So we started to see these barriers, and we became a little bit demotivated, but then we thought, but we are part of this resistance. Everything that we've achieved has been through a lot of resistance, so we're not going to stop. And something that we were able to achieve, to get some funding, not for our organization, but for a partner organization, an indigenous, that managed to get some funding for us. And we developed a project. And within this, we began to come across difficulties because the organization had worked with indigenous people for a long time. You already work with indigenous people, so you should have some idea of where we are. Here I am, I'm really in a remote, they want me to produce an invoice, and how am I going to do that? Here I am, right in this remote area. How am I going to prove that I've bought this thing, but they want one of these big invoices and that we don't get given them? So we began to question. We can't do it this way because, no, the larger organization said, no, it has to be like this. And so we had to run around trying to get these receipts and notes and invoices because we didn't want to lose the funding, and we really wanted to talk to the elders. That was the project. And we wanted to do this spiritual meeting, which was very important. It was a great work. And so, but we came across so many barriers through this funding. How can we justify? We have so we talk, for example, we talk to someone about community traditional medicine. They don't have a diploma because their knowledge is ancestral. How are we going to justify that this person is a professor or a teacher? And they demanded this, they required this for the project. So otherwise they couldn't release the funds. So we had to, I think we had 3 meetings with them trying to explain. And we said to them, look, maybe it was a bit rude, but you've been working with indigenous people for 20 years. How do you not know this? But in the end, it worked in the end. We were able to run the project and to provide accounting, but we had to use the name of a different partner. And we do lots of voluntary work here. We don't have, there's no funding or support to pay the collective. We're running after this, but so far we haven't managed it, but we hope that we will be able to. And something that I think Jonas said that I also know, this issue of we're non-profit organizations, and in the funding, they don't give you any times to, there's no space for you to pay for an accountant or anybody to do all this bureaucratic stuff. And we don't have, it's voluntary work. And this is something that we are seeing, that there is no space within this funding for this kind, to pay for this kind of things. I think my contribution is this, and I'm very grateful for the event. And and I really liked being part of this work. We really hope that it leads to some products, some outcomes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Marianne. It's very important what you said. These barriers that you've faced in terms of bureaucracy and etc. So now I'm going to ask William from the Coletivo Jovens de Veredas, the name of his collectives. He's an environmental activist from the River Amapá in Amazonia. He's part of the PCT network as well, working with traditional communities and defending the forests and valuing riverine youth. So we're passing over to William now. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Yes, we can. Good. Okay. So, as I've already been introduced, I'm from the Amapá River, Mishri Alegre, and I'm part of this youth collective. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the collective here. We don't have much time, just 10 minutes, but I'd just like to try and finish in this time. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the collective of the young people from Biradão. It's from the Amazon region, and it emerged in 2023, exactly wanting to recover young people and bring a sense of belonging to the territory and our origins and our ancestry. And the collective began with popular communications and environmental education and protection. So we wanted to reduce some of the noise of communication, fake news, disinformation, particularly in Amazonas. There's a problem with logistics with communications. It's very difficult to have access within our territory. For example, electricity only came here in 2014. It was a great process for us to adapt to it. And then electricity arrived. Since then, we've been able to have access to the internet. So we thought exactly about to work in communications, particularly in a territory where very difficult in terms of logistics and in terms of communications. And so the idea was to create the collective because of the lack of information in the territory for community youth. We started working with certain themes that were very important. And we looked to train these young people from the territory to train leaders who can work with the media and some cultural projects to strengthen our community. And within all this process, only in 2024, we were able to run our first meetings, see the difficulties we've had with the problem with funding. It's really a difficult context, not just here, but I can see not just in the north, but in the other regions, other people have this difficulties. So in 2023, we had the first meeting, which was great within the community, and we were able to mobilize various young people from various different territories to. What was interesting was that the theme was communications and technology to strengthen the territories. And we talked a lot about technology, the culture of young people within the community, and about the threats that within the territories, and also how to protect the territories. All this communication affecting each other. Since then, we've managed to create a group, a coordination group to work within this territory. And since then, our struggle, our work, our activities have been more specifically, we have this coordination which is divided up between people from each territory, which makes it easier to work as a collective. And we cover now 5 territories, more than 40 communities, more than 100 young people working here. And we've got 14 members of our coordinating team divided over the territories. And if we work 100% through donations, partners. We have a lot of partners within the territories. We support our activities. It works 100% voluntary. Nobody is paid. And within the despite all these difficulties that we've faced, all the barriers, we don't have a specific sustainability fund. We depend a lot on partners to run our meetings. Very often the funding streams are not accessible to our collective. We know that because there's so much bureaucracy, often we can't access this funding to meet our needs. And logistics is another barrier, transport, especially when we're talking about Amazons. This means that we cover a lot of distances. Some places there's no access. And the one challenge is internet connections, for example, particularly for us, because in Beradão, because we're riverside communities, and the territories are very far from each other. So this issue of travel is a problem. And all this work that we do, if we want to go from one place to another, it's very high cost. And sometimes we don't have funding for this. And sometimes we think about doing projects, how to organize things, but we have this issue, this problem of funding. So it's funding and logistics are 2 important points for us. When you bring together all these factors, issues of connections, etc., it makes our work more difficult. But despite this, we managed to go on. We can show, even despite the lack of public policies and funding, we are able to work. We run our meetings, and I'm here to thank Pacova for being able to be part of this research. And we would really like to thank you for this opportunity to take our name and to show our name to other organizations. We know about the importance of our work within the territory and to be able to participate in the research. We're very grateful for that our work and our story has been put into the research and published. And as I said, despite all these difficulties, we keep going on, we keep resisting and showing that the young people in the Amazon, within all the different territories, have a voice, are doing certain things, are determined. So that's it. I think as a member of the collective, well, I would like to reassert our commitment that we are resisting and communicating, and that we need support. We need support and mechanisms to finance it, to fund us that really arrive, for funding that really gets to us at grassroots level. But we're going to carry on producing grassroots communications and working with the territories. I think that's everything. I'd like to thank you, all of you, for participating, and Pakova and all the funders and partners. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, William. We're the ones who'd like to thank you for your participation and for sharing with all the potential that you have. And we know all the difficulties that you have. So we're really grateful for your participation and your contributions. So I'd like to invite the organization for the Southeast, Agência Mural, so the Mural Agency, and represented by Anderson, who's the co-founder of Agência Mural, which is an independent journalism organization, which has been running since 2010 in local news about and for the peripheral communities. And they're looking at new ways of doing journalism allied to technology and business. And they work with different brands, Spotify, Meta, etc. And they're developing strategies for their web portal. Here is Anderson. Thank you, Lavinia. Good afternoon to everybody. I'd like to really thank you for this invitation and to hear all these people that I already know from other places, but I was very pleased with the invitation and the fact that this place is so full, this webinar is so full with people interested in this issue. I would like to say I'm Anderson. I'm from the periphery of Sao Paulo. I'm the son of people from the Northeast, people who left the Northeast, came to Sao Paulo to construct, as we know, our metropolis. I was born and grew up in Sao Paulo, and since 2024, I'm coming back to the Northeast. I'm in Recife at the moment, thinking about communications from this place, being within the Northeast, but working for the Southeast. And so my background as a communicator from the peripheries, in 2010, 15 years ago, some young journalists, a group of young journalists, we met on a popular journalism course, and we were making criticisms about the mass media and the great newspapers and all, Folha and Estadão. Where was our territory? Where were we within this? And of course, we didn't find ourselves. We didn't find Pirituba in Folha de Sao Paulo. They didn't find Capa Redonda or different neighborhoods in Sao Paulo. And so we started from this point of view. So from this movement, we decided to, like journalists and the people from our materials, we started to create our own collective, to talk about our own narratives, to construct our narratives from the peripheral neighborhoods of Sao Paulo. So Agência Moral started in 2010 with 30 people, 30 journalists, communicators, PR people, reporters, photojournalists, etc., who wanted to expose their narratives. And the agency, which is now completing 15 years, we went through 8 years in a pretty much a volunteer model, taking money from our pockets in order to do this journalism, even though we were publishing within the largest newspaper in the north in the country, Folio Sao Paulo. We opened a blog within Folio de Sao Paulo. They gave us space, and it was just a space. We didn't have any funding. They just gave us a space to pay for funding for social media, etc. And in 2018, we, after a long time studying the possibilities to sustain this organization, we managed to get some funding from, which was a very important milestone for us. We got some institutional funding, which is very, very rare within our ecosystem, which never happens. We got this institutional funding to invest in the organization in order to be able to contract people. The first money, we didn't pay journalists. We paid an accountant. We paid lawyers, because in order to be able to continue and to reach other new places. So we were selected by the Open Society Foundation, which is a international funding. It's a journalist and human rights program, and which has unfortunately since been cut, and we have stopped receiving this funding. But for 3 years, we received institutional funding, which allowed us to structure the organization and open doors for other places. So we created a site. From 1 year to another, we were able to get about 60% of the institutional funding, and this was, and the gap that was left was filled with we was paid for by services, which is, so our knowledge about communications, about journalism within Sao Paulo helped us to take Morale to other places so that we didn't have to close. Because when we lost about 60% of funding, it's obviously leaves a huge gap. But so there are possible pathways. Morale has managed it, and we believe in the construction of these narratives, that philanthropy can support journalism as a cause, and we believe that communication and journalism, which is a public service, should be funded like the health services. We take information to people who don't have information, and in a way no other organization manages to reach. We have an example that I like telling people that was important for our trajectory during the pandemic. We remember the largest news program in the country. William Bowler was telling people to wash their hands, in order to avoid coronavirus, but lots of peripheral communities didn't have water, and so how are they supposed to wash their hands? So we needed to look at Morale, and other organizations looked at different ways of protecting our people in the peripheries. So this ecosystem of information, favela, quilombos, original peoples, is a information system that needs to continue to exist, that needs to be funded, not just to do projects, one-off projects, although those are important, and as they were in the pandemic or in certain specific times like we are at the moment in the country, but also for us to, for our own learning and for our legacy, to be able to affect other generations as they come up. So I do this invitation, I give this invitation so that this research can be the start of a conversation so that other organizations can start thinking about this place as a strategic place. Communications and journalism is a strategic place within this ecosystem because we're within the same logic as other parts of the third sector. And I would like to say something as well. We were able to do this movement and search for funding where I am now in Recife. We were able to access funding because we were in the Southeast. We were in the economic and financial capital of Brazil. So I realized, because strategically, when I look back, we were able to find strategic pathways to open these doors. But for example, the funding stream that which was only in English, which is not our language, how are we supposed to, but not using artificial intelligence, but how can we make our proposal in a language which isn't ours, which isn't part of our trajectory? So we believed in this, that it was important to occupy this space, which is how we were able to access this funding. But this is my criticism, because sometimes we need to seize and occupy these spaces that aren't given to us, that aren't offered to us, in order to be able to go further. That we are always being questioned whether we should be in these spaces, because they're not spaces for us, but we need to enter these spaces. And when we talk about funding for the Southeast, the peripheries and the South End, and I always ask, what is this Southeast? When we looked to get money through the Rouanet law in Brazil, in the last 10 years, the peripheral neighborhoods of Sao Paulo haven't received anything from culture, but most went to a neighborhood called Pinheiros, which is a different kind of class in Sao Paulo. So we have to think about, what is this Southeast when we talk about the Southeast? Where's this money going? Where are the peripheral neighborhoods, the low-income neighborhoods of Rio, of Sao Paulo, in the Southeast? How can they access this? But I'm very pleased to be here. I really like the invitation. I think it's an essential discussion for other dialogues as well. And thank you, Alberti, for the invitation, and everybody at Pacofa and everyone who's here. Thank you. Cheers. Thank you very much, Anderson. Mateus has just put in the chat the link for the report, for those who would like to read the report, to see the publication. Because of the time, we're going to go towards to the end. I'd like to thank everybody for being here. It's very important to have so many people, and for all those who are here representing organizations that took part in the research. We thank you for your contributions, and a huge thanks from Pacova for your contribution we're all together in this process of looking at grassroots communications as a right, as a strategy, as an essential element for social transformation. So you can look at the results in the publication, and we're just going to finish now. Al, but would you like to say something? Yes, I think just to thank everybody, and for those who haven't been able to go to our Instagram, because we're going to publish the link there as well. Get in touch through our email, WhatsApp, whichever way is easiest, so that we can carry on these conversations. Thank you very much, everybody.